Well, hello again. And we're here to talk a little bit about getting your tenants to pay your rent. We've gone through April, and in April, most of us got our rent paid. And in fact, other than multifamily, very few tenants didn't pay their rent in April. But now we're in May. Today's the Cinco de Mayo, the 5th of May, and tenants should have paid their rent 5 days ago or sooner. And in a lot of cases, they haven't. And if your tenants paid you your rent, congratulations. You're lucky, or you did a great job screening them, or your tenants are great, responsible tenants. Any way, shape, or form, things are great for you. But if your tenants didn't pay their rent, you shouldn't feel like you're in the minority, because you're not. And tenants that aren't paying because they've been told by the media, which hasn't told the truth on almost anything during this pandemic, that they don't need to pay their rent, you can't evict them, and their rent isn't important. If your tenants didn't pay their rent, your tenants aren't in the minority either. It's going on a lot, and it's impacting a lot of landlords. And the problem isn't should the tenants be paying their rent, because the simple truth is the rent's due. The tenant should have paid it. The problem is the tenants have a mistaken impression or have been given bad information from either the media, politicians, or sometimes housing authorities that are working from home and not completely accurate in what they're sending out for information, that says their rent can't be made due because you can't evict them, so there's no need to pay their rent. But the fact is, rent is due. And rent is the price that they pay for the privilege of living in your home. Your home, not their home. Rent's due. The question is, during this pandemic, and with all the media environment and the political environment and all the stuff that's being passed around, what are your options as a landlord? Before we get to options, though, I want you to think about a couple things. Back in April, a lot of your tenants received a stimulus check. As a matter of fact, most people that filed their taxes before April 15th, actually before May or March 15th, got their stimulus mail direct deposited if they were given a refund. So a lot of your tenants got $1,200 in stimulus. But more importantly, to you as a landlord, if your tenant is truly unemployed or underemployed, they're getting $600 a week from the federal government for applying for unemployment through the CARES Act. $600 a week or $2,400 a month in most markets, in most parts of this country, will cover the rent, will cover the utilities, and likely will cover at least part of their food bills. And that's what the stimulus, or that's what the CARES money was for, so they could pay their bills. That's what unemployment is for, so they can pay their bills. Now, not everybody that applies for unemployment can get all the state's unemployment, because we know that normally the people that are gig workers or independent contractors aren't eligible for unemployment. We also know unemployment is usually either you're not employed or you're employed. There's no middle ground. And in this case, some people are underemployed. They're still working, but they're not getting the same amount of money they were getting before the pandemic started. The CARES Act takes care of that. The underemployed, the gig workers, the independent contractors, the self-employed, they can all get unemployment. They can all get $600 a week if they applied for it. If your tenant hasn't applied for it, you should talk to them about it. But there's been enough media coverage and there's been enough political coverage. There's no reason your tenants don't know about it, and they've likely already applied for it. So, your tenants are getting $2,400 a month. It's safe to assume for a reasonable person, and I'm a reasonable person, you're a reasonable person, your tenants are reasonable people. It's safe for any reasonable person to assume that the tenant has the money to pay the rent. So then why aren't they? Because they've been told they don't have to. They've been told that you can't evict. They've been told that you should be forgiving rent. They've seen media stories where landlords have gone in and not told tenants they weren't going to get their rent, they weren't going to collect rent during this pandemic. That doesn't mean you have to do any of those. None of those are correct. Unfortunately, it is the reality that we're dealing with, and it's the reality that we have to do something about. So, we know the tenants have gotten some money. We know the media and sometimes politicians have told them they don't have to pay rent, but when have they gotten anything right throughout this whole pandemic? I mean, I'm sorry, but if they were responsible for the amount of misinformation they've put out, none of them would be on the air anymore. But we're left dealing with it because that's our job. That's what we're paid for. So let's deal with it. It's safe to say rent is due. It's safe to say the tenant is still in the house on the 5th of May, rent is due. So what are your options as a landlord with rent due? What can you do? Number one, you can still do an eviction. And in fact, you should be following normal forcible detainer or eviction proceedings. When the tenant didn't give you your rent on the 1st, on the 2nd, you should have delivered your notice to them, whether it's a pay or quit notice, a 5-day notice, a non-rent payment notice, whatever it's called where you're at, you should have delivered it to them because the clock starts with that notice. Now, in today's environment and in today's world, with this pandemic panic and this insanity going on, I strongly suggest that you deliver it to them in person and you have a conversation with them about why they're not paying rent or why they think they don't have to pay rent. Have an honest conversation. Explain to them. Don't threaten them. Don't yell at them. Calmly, very calmly, explain to them the results of their actions and the only choices they leave you with through their own action. Now, I would suggest that you record what's going on. It's one thing to have he said, she said. When you have a verbal recording, that helps. Today with cell phones, every one of us can do a video recording, and video helps a whole lot more. You can see how all the people involved in the video were. I suggest when the video goes on, you tell the tenant that you are recording this to protect both of you so there's no misunderstanding between either of what you're trying to agree to. It's in both of your best interest. And I would suggest the rest of your conversation focus on the tenant. We already know your interest. Everybody does. Your interest is getting your rent. So you're trying to stay along that line, but to get your rent, you need to know why the tenant isn't paying. So focus on what the tenant's issue is. And the easiest way to do that is to look at the tenant and say, what can we do today to help you pay your rent so I don't have to do an eviction? And remember, you've already explained about the eviction and how the eviction ends up leaving them with no place to live. What can you do today so I don't have to do an eviction that protects both of us? I'm here to try to work this out so we can both be happy with what's going on. What do I need to do? What can you do? Be prepared to explain that you cannot forgive the rent because you have a mortgage and your mortgage is due. We're already at the 5th of the month, and 10 more days your mortgage is late. None of us know how long this is going to go on nationwide. A week ago in Arizona, we would have thought it was going on through the end of May. Now it's looking like the 15th of May. In some other places, they've already announced the shut-in orders were going to stay in place till July. Well, the end of July, if you miss May, June, July, that's 3 mortgage payments. Bank can start a foreclosure proceeding in many states. And when the bank does the foreclosure, explain to your tenants, they won't have a place to live because you won't own the home anymore. And the bank is not obligated to honor that agreement and not sell the property out from under the tenant. So we need to avoid those negative consequences. We need to avoid the eviction taking you out. And I would offer also to all of you, not so necessarily your tenants, but put under your hat, Although many states say evictions are stayed or aren't occurring during the pandemic, we're finding that even in states that are militant tenant states, evictions are still happening against tenants for not paying, for intentionally not paying. So even though we say evictions aren't occurring, it's possible evictions still occur, but I would point out to the tenant, not so much that's for your knowledge, but to the tenant, as soon as the stay-at-home orders are lifted, we can proceed with evictions again. It'll take me 5 to 10 days to get a court date, and then you won't have a place to live. So in Arizona, you can be out before the end of the month, even though we're in the pandemic, because the state is opening up. It's important for the tenant to understand the reality of where they're at. It's important for you to state facts calmly and clearly. You might also want to include the fact that in many parts of the United States right now, it's very hard to find single-family housing because buyers want to buy homes and there's a supply problem, so there's not enough homes for rent because landlords are selling their rental properties to buyers. This is also causing the rents to increase. In most parts of the country, rents have been increasing 3 to 5% annually. In some areas, are increasing 3% a quarter. So if the tenant and you can't come to an agreement, you have to go through an eviction, their new place is likely going to cost them more in rent, or they're going to have to move into an apartment, which may cost them the same rent as your house. I would be that brutally blunt with the tenant. Remember, the goal here is for you and the tenant to work together to resolve this issue. So you can proceed with the eviction. Now, one of the options that you have is the tenant pays their rent. When you have this conversation, the tenant had the money, they just weren't paying for their own personal reasons. In some ways, that's nice because you got your rent. I would suggest you waive the late fees because it makes you look reasonable and it helps you out and it makes you look human. I would suggest you do that. I would recommend it. However, the problem with the tenant that pays their rent after we have this conversation is the tenant was trying to run a scam on you. The tenant was trying to pretend their rent wasn't due and you didn't know what your rights were. And that is somewhat troubling for the future relationship with a tenant. So if that happens, you're going to have to sit there and decide for yourself how much that tenant was playing games with you versus how much the tenant was actually being straightforward and honest. And there's nobody that can guide you on that. That's kind of a personal feeling. If the tenant is gaming, what's to stop them from gaming next month and starting this again? So if you collect the rent, I would give them a notice. You're already standing there with the 5-day non-payment notice, pay or quit notice. I would also have another notice that you've collected the rent. The tenant is aware the rent is due on the 1st and there are no excuses. If they get into financial trouble and need to do a payment agreement, it's incumbent on the tenant to contact you in person or in writing to make a payment agreement. I would have them sign that to protect your interest, because if you don't protect your interest, nobody is. So if the tenant pays their rent, that's great for now. We'll just assume it's great forever. The tenant was just seeing what they could get away with. That makes them human. And it makes them in the majority of the population in the U.S. right now anyway. What if the tenant says they won't pay? Then you're stuck with the eviction. If the tenant outright says they won't pay, and that's on your recording, there's no sense in communicating anymore. You might as well have the pay or quit notice, and you might as well start filing with the court to get an eviction date, to get a court date so you can get the eviction done. And I would submit the video with them. And if the tenant gets nasty with you and starts threatening you, that's a different eviction that can be done much faster. And that eviction was not stopped because of the pandemic. That's a hostile eviction. You can still do those today. Now, Don't you cause the tenant to get mad, but you have every right to stand up for your rights. And your right is to collect the rent. The tenant is still living there. But don't egg them on. If they say they won't pay, say, I understand. Here's your pay or quit notice. If you don't pay, I'm going to court and I'm going to evict you. And even if you show up to court with your rent, I will still evict you because you just told me you intentionally are not going to pay. And you need to be prepared for that. There's only two other options left open to you. One is a temporary rent reduction. That's what the media and tons of articles on the internet, even on investors' pages, are telling you should do. Well, I don't necessarily disagree with doing a temporary rent reduction. There is no way I am doing a temporary rent reduction without some sort of attached payment agreement, which is your other option, that tells them the full rent is still due. You're just taking a partial payment because of the time and because of the crisis or the pandemic. When you lower the rent for a month, tenants have a habit of thinking that's the new rent forever. And that's bad. I had one that I lowered the rent because her husband died. And for the next several months, she tried to argue that she didn't have to pay me the rest of the rent. It was just that lowered amount. And we even had to fight it in court. Have a payment agreement. If your rent's $1,600 and you're taking $1,000, which covers your mortgage, great. You got your mortgage paid, your out-of-pocket is in good shape, your profits are sitting there in the payment agreement, and say how they're going to pay it. A payment agreement is a powerful tool that we don't use enough, and we always should. We all concentrate on the fact you should never take partial rent. Well, I'm going to argue in this pandemic environment, taking partial rent, even if my rent is $1,600 and I take $800, that's $800 of my mortgage I do not have to come up with out of my pocket. I am better off. But I'm going to back it with a payment agreement. The payment agreement is very specific to how they're going to pay back the other $800. If they're going to pay it at $125 a month until it's paid off, I would give them a payment agreement that shows June's rent for $125 extra, July, August, September, etc., so that they can see what they're paying, and then the last month after it's paid off, back to the normal rent. The same way a bank does it when you do a forbearance program on your loan or a deferral payment program on your loan is like your pay or quit note or like your payment plan to your tenant. It needs to be very specific. There is no way I would take a partial rent payment, or I would take a temporary rent reduction, or I would defer a rent payment without a payment plan program. As payment plans go, in my experience of being a landlord, it's much better off giving a tenant a payment plan program that says they're going to pay a smaller amount per month over the next 8, 10, 12 months, whatever the lease runs, than to say they're going to have to pay all of it in July when the economy opens. Because the reality is the tenant's probably not going to have all of it in July. If they could save money, they would probably have bought a house. So it's much better off to have them pay you on terms than to try the bank game where it's all due after 90 days, 180 days, in my opinion. Remember, it's always better in a time like this to get some money, because you may not have other money coming in either. It's always better to get some money to cover your bills than to get no money. The payment plan is the only real solution if they don't agree to pay the rent now and they don't tell you they're not going to pay the rent at all. The only other solution to get this resolved is a payment plan. Now, this is where the video is really strong, because a lot of times when the payment plan is introduced in court, the tenant will say, you made them sign it. But if you have a video showing you and the tenant negotiating the payment plan and the terms you're putting in were terms that you both came to agreement on, especially if the tenant says, this is what I can do, and that's what the payment plan is, the tenant doesn't have a legal leg to stand on, and there's no judge, even in a tenant-friendly state, There's no judge, even in a tenant-friendly state, that's going to look at that video and look at that contract between you and the tenant and decide in the tenant's favor when the tenant agreed to it and they can see you weren't strong-arming them. Now, it's important that you let the tenant know you did that video, and we started that up front, telling the tenant you were putting the video together to protect both of your interests and make sure you both had the same understanding. It's important to do that. But it's important to get the tenant in a frame of mind that they're going to pay their rent. It's important to understand why they can't pay the rent. It's important to understand how they're going to be able to pay their rent again. If the tenant can never pay their rent again, then you're back to an eviction. So in today's world, if your tenants haven't paid, you should be going to meet with them with a pay or quit notice for non-payment of rent, and you should be prepared right there to come up with a payment plan that you're going to write up later, or if you have your computer with you, you can write up there and you can both sign right there, right then, and take the money that they can afford to pay now and move forward and not waste a lot of your time worrying about this overnight. If you want more information, you can reach me at chris.wilson, WILSON, at live.com. Again, chris.wilson@live.com. If you're interested in becoming a real estate investor and not becoming somebody's bird dog, or you just want to make a change in your life that can help you become more self-sufficient, give me a call. Even if you're just looking to buy or sell houses, I can help you. Give me a call. Remember, paying part of your cost, your mortgage cost, paying part of your mortgage cost and getting some money today is better than not having any money, because it's in your better interest not to have to come up with all the money out of your own pocket. If you didn't understand that before, I hope you understand it now. There's a lot of bad advice out there saying don't take any partial rent during this time. That's incredibly bad advice from people that probably are not landlords. The landlord business is to protect your interest and yourself. Take your own time and do so. Thank you, and have a great day.